Whether it's, you know, you're a businessman, or you drive a truck, or you work at a university, or you're a teacher in a school, or whatever you do, you apply all your resources to serve your fellow man. And by the way, I read a book years ago, I've probably mentioned this before, Gene Edward Veith, some of you know his name. He comments on the fact that it is not God who needs our service. It is our fellow man who needs our service. We come to church on Sunday not to serve God, but to receive from Him the gifts we need to strengthen us and enable us to go out from church during the week and not whine about our situation and worry about our lot in life, but to now use the resources God has given us to serve our neighbor. Our neighbor needs our service, not God. And I think he's got a very good point there. So Joseph here uses all his abilities and resources. Should we say that God trained him for this? Where? In a funny place? As he carried his cross there? In prison? As the chief of the prisoners recognizes Joseph's innate ability, puts him in charge of the entire prison. And Joseph there learns, I'm sure, in those years he spent in prison, how to manage people, how to do things like that, and puts into use his innate abilities. I say that because I think, especially for young people, maybe for all of us as we get older, we look back and can realize it, but certainly for young people, why is God doing this to me? You know, I don't think Joseph, did he ever ask that question? I don't think we ever see him asking, why is God doing this to me? What we do hear him saying later is, you meant it for evil, God meant it for good, to save many people alive. As Joseph looks back and realizes that all those so-called terrible experiences he went through matured him and prepared him for this right here, verses 13 through 26, as he handles everything. If you look at verse 25, the people in Egypt realized what he had done for them. You have saved our lives. The Hebrew says literally, you have given us life. You have caused us to live. And the Egyptians, pagans themselves, realized the great abilities of Joseph. That he, well, I don't know if they would believe this, that through him God saved them, but certainly they give credit to Joseph. Verses 27 and following. You got any questions on those verses? Now I'd like to look at. Verse 27 and following now starts to prepare us for the book of Exodus. And actually the rest of the book will do that. All history is not just random events. It's all part of what the Germans call, they use it in a literal sense, I'm going to use it properly, Heilsgeschichte. There was Historie in German and Geschichte. Both mean history. Ross knows a little German. Maybe you know those two words. Historie just meant facts. Geschichte, that was a word that had a lot more depth of meaning. It meant history that has a point or a purpose. Heils. You know any the German war movies? Heil Hitler, you know, Heil means salvation, okay? Heilsgeschichte meant the history of salvation. And so all these events, which sometimes looked at in isolation, seem very random and without purpose. When we put them in the whole context of stuff, we say, aha, now I see what was going on. And for many reasons, the story of Joseph is a valuable story, but I think this is one among many reasons why the story of Joseph is so valuable. Because as you read his early years, you would tend to think that this is just a kid who is having problems, family issues, jealousy, boy, they don't go on in families, jealousies and bickering and fighting amongst family members. And you know, you wonder, where is this thing going? How can any good come of this story? And yet, as you read through the whole story, we see God had His reasons for letting this thing happen. And I think all of us, as God's people, we are a little piece of that great story called Heilsgeschichte, aren't we? And we need to remember that, not whine and moan so much. The people multiplied in Egypt, preparing for that great day 400 years later. If you look at 27 and following. Thus Israel settled in the land of Egypt, in the land of Goshen. They gained possessions and were fruitful and multiplied greatly. Think of that phrase. Does that, see these phrases, you put in there to kind of ding a bell. Does that cause some memory things to happen? Be fruitful and multiply. Where's that come from? You certainly have in creation, where God blesses Adam and Eve. Later on, Noah, after the flood. Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. We are not intended by God, I guess we could say, to isolate ourselves from the world and withdraw, as was done in medieval monasticism, which the Lutherans never encouraged that. Our goal is to be out in the world. Table of duties, I've mentioned it many times. We need to mention it more. Table of duties thrusts God's people out into the world. You serve God by serving your neighbor where He puts you in life, right? And I know I'm beating a dead dog here on this perhaps, but this whole thing has come full circle with evangelical Protestants in the United States with their big campuses, you know, the church campuses. They have all these activities going on in the church, mission trips, etc., etc., which can, I'm going to put it that way, can give the impression to people that typical, normal work in the secular world is somehow not as God-pleasing as churchly activity. Does that make sense? I'm probably overstating this a little bit, but maybe it needs to be overstated because of what's going on, not only in Roman Catholicism, which historically has always given the impression, if not the direct implication, very clearly, that unless you are a priest or a monk or a nun, married to the church, you are not really serving God. That's the real extreme of this thing. But I think the evangelicals in the United States are basically doing the same thing, where they're giving the impression that if you're not on a mission trip or doing this or that in the church, you're not really serving God. I think this is a mistaken notion, and it certainly goes against Luther's Little Catechism on the Table of Duties, which once again Luther thrusts us out. And if you read that carefully, once again how he throws into the same bucket bishops, listeners, husbands, wives, employers, employees, children, etc., all in the same bucket. As though, and that must, read that back in the Middle Ages, the 16th century, you can go back there mentally, that must have shocked people who were coming out of the Middle Ages believing that churchly work was far more God-pleasing than secular activity. And that's why many people, including Martin Luther, see, he was duped into that too, wasn't he? Because what does he do as he struggles with his sins, and as he, there's in a lightning storm allegedly, and a tree is struck by lightning right next to him. He drops his sword once and cuts his leg and about bleeds to death. And what does he finally decide? Especially in the storm, as the story goes, whether it's fictitious or not, I don't know. There's probably some truth to it. As the lightning strikes near him and throws him to the ground, he says, "Help me, St. Anna, I will become a monk." And he sells his law books and gives up his blooming career, future career in law. His father is furious with him when he finds out that his son Martin, who is very talented, gives up everything and becomes a sycophant of society and becomes a monk, which most Germans at that time had no use for because they just wandered around, they smelled bad, they didn't take a bath, and they begged from everybody and did nothing useful in life. That's how the average German looked at the monks. And here Luther becomes one. And he gives his first Mass. Maybe you've heard this story. And his father and mother come to watch him perform the first Mass. And by the way, that's the right word. Performance. That's what it was. And as he celebrates his first Mass, he comes out, his father greets him, and he says, "Father, you're not proud of your son." And his father looks him in the eye and says, "God said, honor your father and your mother," and walked out. And they made up later in life. But that crushed Luther. He realized he had disobeyed his father, whatever. Didn't bother him though, because I'm obeying God. Well, I think the story of Joseph does show us once again back in the text that we serve God by serving our neighbor. Certainly Joseph understood that. But the fruitful and multiply business, that pops up all over the place. If you look at Exodus chapter 1, first few verses,